What is absolutely new and takes everybody by surprise is the sheer scale of the First World War. By the end of 1914 alone, the French army has had 350,000 men killed in action. That is catastrophic. One of the biggest myths of the First World War is that the ordinary men in the trenches were lions and that they were led by generals who were complete donkeys and didn't know what they were doing. Today, we'll look at why this has been disproven, but we'll also look at how the war was actually won in the end. Firstly, it's important to kind of dispel this myth that the First World War was this industrialised war that literally nobody saw coming. It wasn't the first industrialised war. That was the American Civil War, really, where you had trenches that you would absolutely recognise as being existent in the First World War. Armies knew that the artillery was going to be the dominant arm. They had shown that they understood that they would need to incorporate how that worked with infantry in order to protect them, as well as clear the way for them. They'd begun to realise the importance of machine guns. They knew also that there was going to be a military use for aeroplanes, though they hadn't quite figured out how or why or what that would entail. So why did armies not implement what they were learning in time for 1914? Two reasons. In part, commanders can be accused of finding it really hard to let go of what they knew. So in July 1914, it still would have been considered ridiculous to just write off the cavalry as being pointless. I mean, this has been the dominant part of warfare since the beginning of time. And so to suddenly decide that it absolutely had no use on a battlefield would have been extraordinary, and it just wouldn't have happened. Also, armies find it really hard across the board to let go of the idea of the offensive and acknowledge that all of this new technology, such as artillery, was going to mean that war was going to be more defensive in nature from now on. They'd seen it happen in the Russo-Japanese War just a few years before, but in command of the Germans, Alfred von Schlieffen had said, "Yeah, I noticed that, but we just need to make sure that doesn't happen next time. We can't let ourselves get bogged down in the defensive again because it's not what we do." So rather than acknowledge that this was like a permanent change, they saw it as something that had gone wrong and that they could stop happening the next time. It's similar with the French, who believe that in order to win wars from now on, you were just going to have to attack harder as opposed to adapt. However, it's important to remember as well that change doesn't happen overnight. So whilst you might have seen new trends coming in and acknowledged new technology, it takes a long time for you to implement that at the top level and then for it to trickle down in training and equipment manufacture and all the way down to the man in the trench doing the fighting. You can't simultaneously do what the great powers were doing, which was take an army and suddenly flush it up to millions in number, and also fundamentally change the way it operates and the way it thinks. Those things just can't happen overnight. And unfortunately, in the interim, whilst you're learning those lessons, and whilst you are implementing that change and adapting to it, lives will be lost. What is absolutely new and takes everybody by surprise is the sheer scale of the First World War. By the end of 1914 alone, the French army has had 350,000 men killed in action. That is catastrophic. Neither did any nation appreciate just how much stuff they would need. So let's take the British as an example. The British had fought the Boer War at the beginning of the century, and they acknowledged how important artillery now was and how artillery was going to be dominant. They went away, and by 1914, when the First World War started, they had more shells available to them than they had fired in the entire of the Boer War. So they had seen the problem, they had acknowledged it, they had tried to fix it, but then they didn't appreciate the scale, which means that by September and October 1914, after just a few weeks, all over the front, British gunners are running out of shells. So we need to talk about the men who are in charge, who have been referred to as donkeys. So At the end of the war, these men were regarded as heroes, for the most part. I mean, if there are 40 odd generals at corps level and above, which means they command at least 100,000 men, if you take 40 people doing one job, you're always going to get some people who are better at the job than others. But for the most part, they were regarded as heroes, because don't forget, they had won the war. They hadn't failed in the end. By the 1960s, however, they'd all died out. But I think the last one died in the 1950s, which means that they were gone and historians take over. And historians started to assess them differently. And for about 30, 40 years after that, this is where this lions led by donkeys comes about. And it comes from one book, which now if you go back and you read it, is a really bad book. But that was the title, Lions Led by Donkeys. And it held sway. And if you've been watching Blackadder while you're studying the First World War, you'll see so many of the ideas that were generated in this period coming into action. So there will be a joke about the fact that while the men are in the trenches, the generals are 10 miles to the rear living in a chateau. Well, yeah, of course they are. It takes 12 weeks to train an infantryman to be able to hold a rifle, go into the trenches and attack the Germans. It takes 20 to 30 years to train a general. You cannot replace them overnight. If they are anywhere near being shot at by the Germans, something's gone very, very wrong. They need to be further back. They need to have a better position to the rear to observe everything that's happening in front of them. So throwaway jokes like that caught on and kind of established this myth that they were all useless. And I mean, the general that's in Blackadder is a laughingstock. He's an absolute idiot. And it's funny, but it's built on this whole principle that all of the generals were donkeys, and they absolutely weren't. Nobody had any answers to the First World War. Yes, they'd acknowledged that technology was training. Then the scale of it shocked everybody. Everybody's plan on how to win a war had failed. Nobody had won by the end of September 1914. But then you've got millions of men on battlefields all over the world, and you have to find a way to try and win a war. And they've got no reference point to start from, or very little reference point, and certainly not on this scale. Even the Germans, who were like the most prepared of all the countries that went to war in 1914, had never actually practiced sending millions of men into the field in one go. So nobody had a decent reference point to start with. And so what you have to do is try different things. And unfortunately, in the course of trying different things, lives are lost, and you don't get it right every time. You don't see a whole new kind of world conflict the world has never seen before in the whole of its history and get everything right first time. So when you're looking at them and you're assessing them, you have to say, were they in fact, as we've accused them of, doing the same thing over and over and over again with absolutely no improvement? Well, no, they're not. So let's talk about the Battle of the Somme. On the 1st of July 1916, everybody goes over in a wave over the top, and it's a disaster, and it's the worst day in British military history, and there's something like 19,000 men killed in one day. They don't do that again the next time. When they go forward next summer at Passchendaele, they've changed. Now they attack in like what they call worms, with one guy at the front in a line, because you give less of a target for the German guns to shoot at. In 1918, things have changed all over again. So by this point, we're defending in depth. So the British front line in 1918, when the Germans attack in the spring and try and win the war, doesn't have that many men in it. It's called a forward zone, and it's loose little pockets of men. Then there's the battle zone behind it, and it's called that because that's where you intend to do the battle. What you do is you let the Germans come a certain way forward until it's not convenient for them anymore, and they've maybe not got the support of their guns behind them, and they've started to get tired and confused, and that's where you fight them. And then there's a rear zone behind that as well. So the idea that generals just kept, and there were some bad generals, but the idea that they all just kept doing the same thing again and killing people and learning nothing from it and achieving nothing is not true at all. Just unfortunately, whilst you're learning all of these lessons and while you're training yourself and your men to fight a new kind of warfare, people will die whilst you do the trial and error to get there. So how was the war won by the Allies in the end? In any war, technology advances really, really quickly, because the kind of money you would invest in something like developing aeroplanes for the military will suddenly go from being something that people want to spend as little money in peacetime on as possible to throwing everything at it to try and get the better of your enemy. So technology rapidly moves on in a war, and we saw this. So Britain, when the war started, had about a dozen good aeroplanes that went into battle. You look at the size of the RAF by the end of the war, and it's like the biggest air force on the planet. It's massive, and there's hundreds of squadrons. That has built all the way through the war. But you've had all of these unique kind of technologies building. So artillery has developed, especially with how you use artillery has really developed. So in the Boer War, there's kind of this really rudimentary attempt to use shells as a curtain to protect your troops when they were attacked. That has developed massively. They've gone from bunny hopping the curtain on to it creeping in front of the men, and developed that as the war's gone on. Aeroplanes have developed so much. Like they didn't have bombs attached to them at the beginning of the war. They didn't have guns attached to them. There's comical accounts at the beginning of the war of British and German pilots flying past each other and just waving, because they were basically there to do reconnaissance. But now you've got fighter pilots. So in terms of the air war, they were never there to fight. They were there to go and take photos and look at the enemy as artillery and spy on the enemy, because you could do it from a great height at very little risk. But then the enemy doesn't want that to happen, so they start shooting at them. So then you take planes up to shoot at the enemy to protect them. And that's how you end up with fighter pilots being born in the First World War. So that's happened. And there is stuff that's wholly new in the First World War, like tanks. Britain is the first to use them in 1916 in the latter part of the Battle of the Somme. There are no tanks at the beginning of the war. And by the end of the war, they've become really, really important. And the side that wins the war, the Allies, does it by realizing that in order to effectively beat your enemy, you have to take all of these things that have developed really quickly over the course of the war and figure out how you can use them as one to complement each other. And we call that an all-arms battle. And the reason that the Allies won the war is because they were the first ones to figure out how to effectively use all of this modern technology in one lump as one force to beat the Germans. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. We've looked at how the war was won, but next time we're going to be looking at what happened when it was, and actually when it ended, because I really don't think it ended when you think it did.